All right, Lone Star Gunners, welcome to the podcast. This is Lone Star Gun Talk, the official podcast of Lone Star Gun Rights, and I am your humble host, as always, Derek Wills. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we have kind of a special treat for you. We have the creator of the Repeal the Hughes Amendment Facebook page, and his name is Jamie Forbush, and he is making a film on the National Firearms Act as well as some other things. And he is here with me today. Jamie, are you there, sir?
I'm here.
It's
good to be here, Derek.
Well, thank you for coming on very much. I really appreciate it. Guys, go ahead and chime in with where you're from, and as we go along, if you guys have questions for Jamie, please feel free to chime in. Jamie, first of all, let's get into a little bit about you. Who are you? What do you do? And what makes you passionate about, Second Amendment rights, and particularly the National Firearms Act and the Hughes Amendment?
Well, I've really loved firearms my whole life. I think just it's the engineer in me, if you will. I love how firearms work. They're fascinating to me. I think I really got turned on to firearms when I watched the movie Aliens when it came out back in the late 80s. I just was fascinated. I loved the way the guns sounded. And then I, later on realized, well, they don't sound like that at all. But I just, over the years, I've really developed a passion for history and our rights. Our Constitution. History has been a very big thing for me, and as I've studied it more, I've realized that we're going down a path that has been repeated many times in history. We're losing our rights, and our Second Amendment rights are paramount to all other rights that we have. If we lose those, we lose everything. So I just want to help people understand that more and become more passionate about it, and have an understanding and respect for our founders and why they put in place the things they did to guarantee those natural rights that we have.
So, you're kind of a history junkie of sorts, particularly as it relates to the gun control laws of the United States, and you've kind of delved pretty deeply into how things like the National Firearms Act came to existence. What sorts of things have you learned that you believe that most people don't know about those pieces of legislation that you feel that everyone should?
Well, as I was discussing with you before we went live here, just in reading, I've had to do a lot of studying of the NFA. Just the hearings, the 9066 bill that went through back in 1934. There's a lot there to read and pick apart and study. And I'll tell you, we think politicians nowadays are crooked and in violation of their oath. But you go back and you read some of the stuff that was said in these hearings by elected representatives in the U.S. House. It's appalling. And it ought to scare the hell out of every single American who reads anything of it. And to me, the National Firearms Act is probably the most egregious violation of the Second Amendment that there is. It's the first big thing that ever went through. It set precedent that said, okay, well, we can whittle away here, we can tax here, we can prohibit. Well, what's to say that in this day and age today that more items can't be added to that? And that's exactly what that framework is to be able to add additional types of firearms and arms to that exact tax law. And so if we sit silent and we allow that to continue on, then we're consenting to have all of our firearms added to that or removed from us completely. The other thing is that the National Firearms Act went through before you and I were ever even born. We didn't get a say in this. We were born into a sense of tyranny already. And so where was my say on that? So I'm having my say now, and I want to help other people have their say on that. But they need to realize how bad it is.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that. I am an avid lover of Thomas Jefferson. I believe that Thomas Jefferson is my spirit animal, and he has helped guide me into the person that I am today from a non-parental standpoint. And one of the things that Jefferson believed, and whenever he says this, he's not referring to the Bill of Rights. He's referring to the form of government. He believed that every 19 years, which he defined as a generation, every 19 years we should abolish the Constitution and start over, for the very reason that that the next generation hasn't had a say on what the previous generation created. Now, in theory, it's interesting to think about, but in practice, obviously, something like that couldn't work because just because of the dynamic that human beings have as it relates to government. And I would have seen that if it were actually put into practice. I'd probably see it as we would be far worse off in this country right now today if we had recrafted the Constitution and our laws every 19 years than we are currently. But that whole thing aside, your point is well taken in the fact that that we're bound by laws that our grandparents' parents created, or our grandparents' parents created.
Yeah.
And not to mention, we don't think about the NFA too terribly much from today's standpoint, in that a $200 tax is not really that outrageous. But what we forget is that the dollar has devalued by over 96%. And so at the time, that $200 was very cost prohibitive. It was it was several $1,000s. If I remember my inflation calculator correctly, I believe that $200 in 1934 was over $5,000 today.
It was very prohibitive.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, and this is going to the Hughes Amendment, which is the other part of your passion project, is that when the Hughes Amendment, which banned fully automatic weapons, was enacted in 1986, the price of an M16 with select fire went from about $700 to $20,000 overnight. Again, making another cost prohibitive, and it's not necessarily a tax, but a cost prohibitive restriction on a certain type of firearm. Because at that point, you can't manufacture anything prior to a date anymore. So everything's surplus.
Exactly.
And so anyway, I don't mean to go off into the weeds here, but let's get back to let's get back to some of the other things about it. We also had.
Can I just add?
Yeah,
I just add one thing real quick, Derek?
Absolutely.
Hold that thought. But just to answer a couple things that you brought up there, the NFA tax nowadays, $200 isn't much money for most people. But let's think of it in this term. If you look at the NFA, if you want to have a short-barreled rifle or a transferable machine gun, regardless of what the cost of those weapons may be to procure, the point is that if you don't pay that $200 tax and have that stamp sent back to you on that Form 1 or that Form 4, if you're caught with that weapon in that configuration without that tax, you are criminalized. That's why we're calling this movie Protected Criminality, because it's a protected right in which you're being criminalized for exercising if you don't pay that $200 extortion money. That's what I call it, is extortion money, because you're being extorted in exchange for, okay, well, we won't throw you in prison for up to 10 years if you pay this $200 tax. That's the conditions in which we're going to grant you the right that's already your protected right. So what I'm trying to do is put it into perspective that way for people to understand just how egregious it is.
Right, and not to mention, I mean, if anybody who is of the pro-liberty mindset, they're familiar with the tragedies at Ruby Ridge and at Waco. And to be honest, those tragedies were entirely caused at their foundation because of the existence of the National Firearms Act.
Yep. The National Firearms Act is more dangerous by far than any weapon or weapon type that is on its prohibition section, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking back to Ruby Ridge, I had a show not too long ago where I had another podcast host on, and his name is Phil Rabelais, and he hosts the Matter of Fact podcast, and we talked about Ruby Ridge for a bit. And if you really think about it, Randy Weaver and Randy Weaver's entire family was killed by the FBI over a matter of a few $100s in taxes. And that sort of thing is atrocious, and
it is,
and all because there is a mandatory tax on an inanimate object that really nobody who would have followed the NFA or will follow the NFA is going to do anything bad with it. So you don't need it to begin with. But anyway, I digress. So let's get back to you. You started the Repeal the Hughes Amendment Facebook page, and now you are taking on this other venture where you are creating a film that you have called Protected Criminality. Protected Criminality. I'm sorry about that. And why don't you give us a quick synopsis of what the film is going to be about?
You bet. Well, first of all, just a correction. I didn't start the Repeal the Hughes Amendment page or group. A good friend of mine did, and I'm not going to mention his name because he didn't give me permission to say that here, but I can't take credit for that. I helped him manage it. I had a lot of information to it, and it's really been fun, and I've really appreciated being able to help people understand things better through that venue. But in terms of the movie, I just, over the years, I've become really frustrated because we sit and we argue on Facebook about things, or you'll read an article about how someone else was criminalized for having a weapon in a configuration that they're not supposed to have. They didn't pay the tax or whatever the case may be. And you sit there and you feel powerless. It enrages you at the idea that, okay, we are literally in tyranny here, but we can't do anything about it. And you and I, most of us are the type of people, we're not violent people. We're not going to go out and start a war tomorrow. And so what do? You want to keep things civil. You want to get it so people understand things, but how do you get that word out? And my coming from the background of doing special effects and filmmaking, broadcasting, all of that jazz, I figured, well, gee, I got these talents. Why don't I put them to some good use somewhere besides just needlessly arguing with people over stupid stuff? Let's get people's emotions involved where they can really start to learn things. I've noticed that people are much more efficient in how they learn things when you inject some emotion into it or some entertainment of some sort. It really helps it stick in their mind more because it's getting a much broader range of things going in the mind. There's some psychology behind it. And so and it's the same kind of psychology that we both deal with when we read these stories about people being incarcerated, merely for exercising their rights. So let's put that into a dramatic scene and use history and use proper history to describe how to get out of the situation. So the movie is quite simply just about a guy who did just what we read about all the time. He had an NFA type of weapon, and one of his neighbors, who was a trusted best friend, ended up telling someone about him, and that got back to the federal government, and of course we all know what happens after that. And so what it portrays is that your own best friend or family member could be your worst enemy in this day of rat people out the government. We're creating a society where so and so rats out so and so. It's he versus she, and so. But what happens ultimately in the movie is he is told to go ahead and just take the deal, and he says, "No, I'm not going to take the deal," because he's principled. He understands principles of liberty, and he says, "I'm not going to take this deal because it's not right. I'm going to fight this." An attorney says, "Well, gee, you're not going to win. I don't care. Then we better figure out. We better go back through history. Let's go back through time. Let's study all of these, the NFA, the founding of our nation, the Hughes Amendment. Let's study all of these, find out where the Achilles heel is so that we can present our case to a jury and have a jury nullify this clearly unconstitutional set of laws that is being used to prosecute him." And so that's the premise behind the movie. It's to get you upset in a way that you can have some emotion there, but in a positive way, to say, well, hey, here's the constructive method in which we can go and combat these types of egregious violations of our rights. Here is the remedy if people will take it and actually start to put it into motion. If we can teach the public, hey, if you're called to be on a jury, do you know what the Constitution actually says in it? Do you know what your rights are that it protects? The Constitution doesn't grant rights, as we know. It's a set of principles that protects an already set of rights that are inherent for us. But if people don't know those and they go get on a jury, they're just going to be told what the law is. The judge says, "I will instruct you to the law." Well, what is the law? Do you know what the law is? You have a mind for yourself. Use it.
Right, and I'll tell you, I am very impressed with how this synopsis just kind of goes into just various different means of, well, about liberty in general. So it's about the right to bear arms, but you also have jury nullification, which is a very important part of the process that most people don't understand or even know about. It's one of those things that people need to understand, that it's their right as a juror to find somebody not guilty of a crime, even though there might be ample evidence for a conviction.
Yep.
For the fact that they don't believe that what they did should be a crime. It's a
exactly.
If you really think about it, jury nullification is one of the final checks against the government.
Absolutely.
As it relates to prosecuting of crimes. Now, that's not going to establish precedent where nobody will ever be held for that crime again, but at least that person will not be found guilty of a crime that shouldn't be a crime to begin with. You also mentioned, I'm just sorry, I'm reading through a couple of the comments here. Jacob says, "My problem with the NFA is that year wait for my firearm, the extensive checks, and the fact that I'm the only person who can be in possession of my firearm. And even if you get a trust, you have to make sure that those are the people that you want to share it with."
Exactly.
And another thing that I really appreciate is that you're taking this emotional kind of spin on things. And I've long maintained that there are only two ways to really think: emotionally and logically. You can't. They're antithetical forms of thought. So you can't think logically while being emotional, and you can't think emotionally if you are a logical person. I mean, well, that's not exactly what I mean, but basically, you can't think logically if your emotions are controlling you. That's essentially the point. And that's why the left is so good at what they do, because they drive emotion, because emotion connects with people. If you really kind of want to put a twisted way about it, emotions are sexy. They appeal to people because people can relate with emotions. They're like, oh, children are dying. That's awful. Oh, Randy Weaver is a part of a local Ku Klux Klan organization. That's an awful human being. Or David Koresh and his family, they're doing weird things. All of these emotions just are crammed down our throats. And that is why we end up with some of the most awful pieces of anti-liberty legislation that we have. Just as a for instance, here in Texas, I was briefly mentioning to you about what happened with SB 10 and SB 11, which I'm hoping to cover on a future show. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about it, guys. But one of the things that all of the media were reporting was that Jonathan Stickland did this. Oh, and by the way, we're just going to throw this out here. It was just a few days after the anniversary of the Santa Fe high school shooting, because they want to keep that emotion tied to everything because it is so powerful. And unfortunately,
never let a good tragedy go to waste.
Exactly. And unfortunately, whenever people's emotions are charged, that's how you end up with bad public policy. And it doesn't have to be with firearms. It could be with literally anything else.
Exactly.
And one other point that you brought up is how it was a trusted friend who said something, and that ultimately led to the course of events that's going to take place in this film. That sounds awfully similar to what's going on with the red flag laws, too.
Yep, it sure does, doesn't it?
and those are awful laws to begin with. Again, driven by emotion. And what we've already seen, one person who has been killed as a result of red flag laws in Maryland, where he didn't know what was going on because all of them are ex parte hearings because reasons. And next thing he knows, he has police, beating down his door, telling him to give up his guns, and he's like, no. And then ultimately, he ends up getting shot and killed as a result. It's amazing that I appreciate the fact that you're able to transform the left's, playbook of using emotions to tell a story in order to try and logically explain why all of this is absolutely awful.
Well, emotions, we have them for a reason. I've studied psychology for a long time. I spent a lot of years in the criminal field of investigating people, computer crimes, so on and so forth. And so I've studied a lot about emotion and human psychology in general, and I'll tell you, we have it for a reason. It helps us learn things. If we can channel emotion correctly and not abuse it, that's what the left does, is they abuse emotion. They use it, they overuse it, and there's never any remedy to a situation. It's always bringing up the problem. What we have to do is we have to learn to channel it correctly by saying, hey, here's a problem, and it's concerning. And yeah, we may get a little emotional or a little upset about it at first. But the objective is to say, hey, now let's take this alarming situation or this alarming idea, and let's channel it into something that's constructive. Even our own gun rights community, a lot of people are so emotionally driven to a negative, and that's what this film hopes to get rid of too. Even on the Repeal the Hughes Amendment page, we have this happen all the time where people get on and, oh, it's never going to happen. You're never going to get this repealed, or you're never going to get this nullified. We're effed, is essentially the message. And it's like, no, you can't think like that. Yeah, there's a problem. We know it. We recognize it. Our rights are being violated. Now let's come together. Let's be precision about how we take this apart. And so we can use that emotion for something very positive. And that's what this film is trying to do, is use that emotion and channel it and give people some form of hope that says, hey, this really can be done. Juries really can nullify laws that are not constitutionally correct. And just another point you brought up there, Derek, a few minutes ago, you talked about Ruby Ridge and then you brought up Waco, which both are direct results of how dangerous and deadly the NFA is. isn't it interesting that you and I both sit on this podcast here, and you're in Texas, and I'm in Idaho? Um, it's very fitting, I believe, that we're on this call talking about these things, representative of these American tragedies that have happened in the same states that we're both in currently.
You know, that's an interesting coincidence, if I may say so myself. So where are you at with this film? You're trying to raise funds, correct?
Yeah, so this is a film, typically stuff that's made, there's a budget for it, and it's a budget that you have to sink in, or you have to fund it yourself. But this is something that we're never going to make a profit on it. Any time that someone watches it, whatever, we don't want to make a profit on it. We want them to freely be able to have distribution or give distribution of it. And here's why. Because if I make that hard for you to watch, if you got to pay money to watch it, to rent it, buy it, whatever, it may not be a very effective tool. Let's say you've got a bunch of friends who are having a difficult time understanding some of these laws, or they don't want to understand them. And let's say you say, hey, well, here's this tool that I can use. I want you to be able to freely have access to it, to either distribute it to them or show it to them without having to have any cost accrued in that. And so the only way we make that available is to make it free. And where it's going to be free, we're not going to make any money on. We're not going to be able to feed our families off of it. So the only way we can do this is to crowdfund it reasonably. That's the only way we can do it. And so the challenge has been to get people to understand that, to understand who I am, to be accountable to people, to get out there and have the utmost being frank with people about it. You name it. Trying to be very transparent as to what we're doing. And I'm having a difficult time with that to some extent. People are not putting two and two together. We've done paid Facebook advertising, and people who, a lot of people like it, but likes don't help us.
Right.
What helps is someone going to the page and the funding page and reading a very extensive amount of information that goes into detail on this, or watching the video. And what's interesting, Derek, is I've noticed is people actually contribute to it either on PayPal or on GoFundMe. As people watch the video, because I can see when they watch it, it almost directly correlates to when we get someone contributing versus people just like it because they see it and it looks cool in their Facebook feed. They're not actually getting the information. They're not putting two and two together, and that's the most difficult time we're having is getting it correlated. I had two questions that we had answered this morning on the protected criminality page. Someone saying, hey, tell me about this. I don't know what you're trying to do. And that's not their fault. Somehow we have failed, or Facebook has failed, or something in painting that picture for them and getting them to that page where they could have seen all that information. And once I answered their questions, which is already spelled out very in detail on the description, they felt happy that their questions were answered. So we're not getting that correlation made, and that's been the most challenging part of it up to this point.
So how much money do you expect that you'll need to raise in order to make this project become a reality?
So where this has got to be a movie that's done right, keyword done right, in order for it to be taken serious by people. It's by all means, it's not a high budget movie. High budget movies are hundreds of millions or 50 plus million. This one here is going to require about 1.2. And we're going to need to get to about 600 in order to start active production on it. So in the grand scheme of things, that's a very small amount of money, especially in the crowdfunding market these days. So it's entirely possible We're in it for the long run. We're not going to bow out just because the going gets tough. If we have to take more time to do it, we're going to do it, and we're going to keep pressing on it. Because at this point, we're committed. People have already given us money, and we have a responsibility to them to make sure that something good comes out of this. And so we're in the initial stages of the crowdfunding. We've got almost a couple $1,000s at this point. Many more thousands to go, obviously, but we'll get there. But what is going to be needed is to continue to hammer this point. You know, for me to come on podcasts and radio shows and level with people, have them get into my head a little bit to understand where I'm coming from and why I wanted to make this. Once people can catch that passion, I have no doubt that they're going to come into this, and some people will come into it with greater sums of money. You know, we have a kind of a gifting system on it as well. Depending on how much people give, they can be in the credits, opening credits, closing, you name it. So we want to recognize people and recognize that, hey, you're part of the community that put this together. You know, this is a community tool for teaching. Well, guess what? You're part of that community. You helped contribute to it. And we want you to be recognized if you don't mind having your name out there. So there's a lot of facets to it.
You know, I got your Facebook page up here on the monitor for people to see, and I'm just kind of scrolling through, and you post a lot of really great information here, like this, a quote from Congressman David John Lewis. Approaching the subject of firearms, would you not consider that society is under the same duty to protect the innocent that it is with regard to the automobile, and that with a view to the attainment to that result? The person who wishes the privilege of bearing firearms should submit to the same regulations as rigid as automobile owner and driver is required to accept. You know, I think I've heard that before. That sounds so familiar to me, and I can't understand why. They've never said something like that before. I've never heard that. Am I wrong here?
I love the key word privilege. Privilege.
Right. You know, if you have to ask for permission to do something, you don't have the right to do it. Period.
Exactly.
End of story.
Exactly.
And it blows my mind that there is a large group of the population that is okay with things like this, but it has to do with the fact that their emotional centers have been triggered because of the fact that people have been killed.
Well,
and
fear governs.
Well, yeah, and
fear governs, and if you can give people some fear, then they'll allow their fellow citizens to be governed in ways that they shouldn't be governed. You know, people need to understand that the real only responsibility of the government is the protection of life, liberty, and property. And those are the things the government's failing the most at these days. It's not to take liberty, it's to protect liberty. And so doesn't matter what kind of arms, if I'm using them to harm your life, liberty, or property, or threaten them in any way, then I'm committing a crime. You become a victim. But my merely having possession of those things, whether it be because I like them, I'm fascinated with them, or because I want to protect myself in the future, whatever, that's no one's business, but whatever that case may be, if I'm not harming someone with them, I mean, what we've created as a society, in essence, is this idea of minority report. You may commit a crime if you have a machine gun. You may be a bad guy. Well, you know what? You may be a bad guy if you have a knife, too. I mean, everyone may be something because they have something. It's where do you go with that, and how far do you let that go? The principle to me is that we protect liberty, and the government's failing miserably at that.
Right.
So,
well, let's not forget the the words of Congressman William Hughes. What sporting purpose does a machine gun have? As to what sporting value? Who needs a machine gun?
Yeah. Notice how he wouldn't even let him read he wouldn't even allow the reading of the bill. He interrupted the reading of the bill 4 or 5 times throughout that committee hearing.
Yeah, and it passed with a voice vote, and well, I don't like the idea of a voice vote because there's no record on it. It just says passed via voice vote. And I think that if any elected official is setting the policy of the United States, they should be required to go on the record as to how they voted. I've never liked the idea of a voice vote. And I just, it just allows for one, it's subjective because the chairman can always say, oh yeah, I think the ayes were louder, or I think the nays were louder, on whatever it was. And in fairness, if you watch that video of the Volkner substitute getting passed, yeah, the ayes were a bit louder, but it was one of those things where it was just one of those late night cram it through things.
Yep.
But all of that.
Who was present and who wasn't?
Yeah, and all of that aside, Congress ended up passing it with that amendment in there, and Reagan ended up signing it with that amendment in there, knowing full well that amendment was in there. We can't just be mad at William Hughes. I mean, obviously he was the architect of that amendment, but let's be real here. Gun control has never become law without the support of Republicans. And it's one of those things that just drives me absolutely crazy. Oh,
you and I both.
I hate to drastically change subjects, but real quick, I want to let everybody know here. We sent out an email to our members yesterday about there's a bill that went through the House that would allow the carrying of a handgun during a state of disaster for 168 hours. And the Senate got the bill, and one senator named Joan Huffman, who I cannot stand that woman, decided that was too much of a breadcrumb of liberty to be given back to us. So she put in a substitute that said 48 hours. Well, it just broke today, ladies and gentlemen of Texas, that substitute was rejected, and the Senate has concurred with the 168 hours. I'm actually surprised that happened.
Wow.
So if we experience another Hurricane Harvey, you will have 1 week of constitutional carry. Congratulations. Yay, crumbs of liberty.
Texas.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Getting back to this. So what sorts of, aside from monetary, you're in Idaho. That's definitely going to be, are you planning on filming in Idaho, or are you looking at locations, or what's the?
So both Utah and Idaho is where we'll be filming, and then I'm also got a couple of other locations that we'll be filming at as well to be announced, just because we're still working the details of it out. But yeah, a majority of it will be filmed here.
Okay. And I assume that you would be very much interested in having some volunteers.
Oh, absolutely. This again, where this is not a for-profit venture, production, whatever you want to call it. A lot of input, a lot of volunteering, a lot of donation of financial resources, or contribution is the word I like to use. And the most importantly, the promotion or pushing of it, getting it out there so that people when they hear the term protected criminality, they know what that means. And that takes a while to establish that kind of rapport. And I've had a lot of people ask me, why did you name it protected criminality? What's the sense in that? And, it speaks for itself. You just got to be able to put 2 and 2 together. We have a protected right, or a set of protected rights. They're inherent, but people are being criminalized for them. So I wanted a simple two word title for it, so it wasn't this big long title. There's reason and meaning behind it. You just got to think about it for a minute. But once we get that rapport with people knowing the title and associating it with what that means, we're going to be on a much faster path to success. And that only happens by people pushing it and helping others understand it.
Well, you already have one volunteer. Jacob says that I'm actually trying to get into acting. I'm more than willing to volunteer my time for the smallest of parts. So, Jacob, if they hit their target and they can start filming, I'm sure that Jamie would love to have you up in Idaho to
We'd
help
love
out.
it.
Yeah.
We'd love it.
Well, I'm going to keep pushing this, guys. If you're listening to this, the Facebook page is Protected Criminality Movie. I put a link in comments here, but I will also put it in the show notes if you're listening to the audio only version. And help these guys out. Share everything that they can. Like their page, and if you can, shoot some donations over to them, because that's the only way that we're going to get this film made. Unless we have a major contributor just say, yeah, I'll finance the whole thing. Which would be great, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. So, small donations make things happen. So,
yep. Just your lunch money.
Yeah.
I mean, what you might spend on lunch for 1 or 2 days would help. We get enough people in there. It's a volume thing. I'm not asking everyone to just throw thousands of dollars at it. Throw $5, $10, $15 at it. Even what you might spend on lunch for a day or two. Just put a little bit of something in there. And the faster that flows in, the crowdfunding is kind of tricky, and I'm learning what an art it is and how ill-equipped that we are because we've never really done this crowdfunding before. But it's a thing where if it speeds up and more people are putting in, then other people feel more content to put in as well, because it looks like something that's going somewhere. Whereas if it's not going anywhere, then no one puts anything in, and that's the time when everyone really needs to be putting something in. So it's something we have to get the momentum up there and then really keep it going to meet those goals. And whether that can be done in a couple of days. Some people crowdfund millions of dollars in a couple of days. Others take years to crowdfund, and so it's just it really just depends. It's in the hands of the people at this point.
Right.
But we'll get there one way or the other. We have to. We're committed. We owe a great deal of allegiance to people who have already put into it, and that is sacred money that is earmarked in a bank fund, and it's just sitting there until it's built to the point where we can begin active production.
Right. Well, as the adage goes, it's easier to get 1 million people to give you $1 than one person to give you $1 million. That's kind of the mentality that you're going for in the tactic. Before I wrap things up here, do you have anything else that you want to? Oh, by the way, Ryan says put me to work. So you got a couple of volunteers here. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell people, either about your film, or yourself, your page, anything like that you'd like to leave with everybody?
Well, I just we're all good people. I believe that everyone in this effort and in other gun rights efforts, I know Lone Star Gun Rights, we're all good people. We're not violent people. We're not people who are out there to hurt people, anything of that sort. We just want our liberties, and it is time that we come out and be upfront and honest about it. Some people say, well, you don't. Why would you need a machine gun, or why would you need this? Well, the need factor has never been important. The factor is that it's a set of principles, and we're trying to push those principles out to people so that they can understand the bigger picture. It's like bump stocks. How many people did we see come out and say, well, gee, bump stocks are stupid. They don't do the real thing. No one needs them. I can do the same thing with my trigger. Well, That may be true. I've never even used a bump stock, to be honest with you. I've never fired one. I don't own one, and I just never really saw the purpose. It's just a novelty item, okay? But who am I, and who are you? Tell anyone else that they don't need that. Maybe that's just something they find joy in, that they want to take to the range for a couple of kicks and giggles. You know, whatever their case, we have principles of liberty. And that's the important factor that we have to remember. If we could get everyone to be principled in understanding that, hey, you and I don't have the right to control other people and tell them what they need and don't need. That's the point we're trying to drive home. And as people start to understand that more, you know, we can have a society that lives and let live. And guess what? The bad people that truly want to harm you and I and everyone else who's innocent, they're not going to try very hard, because they're going to know that they'll be stopped.
Right.
That's
and
something we all have.
not to mention that those who will try have a higher chance of getting stopped, and therefore lives could actually be saved by dialing back all of these restrictions. You know, our organization has always been, our main focus right now is trying to get constitutional carry passed, and everybody's like, well, you got blood in the streets, you know, or as the speaker says, oh, this is only wanted by people who live out in the woods in a cave somewhere. It's just one of those. It's disheartening, but I'm so glad that that you are pushing this project, and that you are wanting to get this project to be made. You know, I kind of, a little self plug here. You know, I'm working on a book that kind of tackles the very same thing, but from a standpoint of overall liberty for various different issues. And you know, I think that if people who are liberty minded can actually come together and unify and push a message of liberty, and do so in the way that you're doing, I think that more people, like the average Joe, the folks, if you will, as politicians like to refer to them, the average people who aren't really politically savvy, all they you know, they might turn on the news every once in a while, they might you know, they probably vote in presidential elections if they do at all, but really aren't too terribly worried about Democrats or Republicans or anything like that. They just are. I think some of those people, they might resonate with that message. And as soon as you get their attention, then you can approach from an advocacy standpoint and say, look, these people who are currently in power are doing this, and you, as an individual, have the power to help us stop them, and the responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. And as Ryan says, we need to take back the narrative. Ryan, you're absolutely right. The narrative, it's an uphill battle regardless, and it always will be, because the political elites do not like liberty, and they will actively try and squish the pushing of liberty, because, and they might do so because they honestly believe that granting that type of liberty will be dangerous, and they are genuinely concerned about the well-being of people. They're misguided. But
couple points.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I trust my fellow Americans, and I don't know what has taken place that so many politicians, whether it be the federal, state, local level, why they distrust the people in which they serve or are supposed to serve. You know, if I knew that my neighbors all had machine guns, it'd be all the better. You know, I wouldn't feel unsafe, because I trust the people who live in this country with me. Yeah, there's some bad apples here and there, but they're so far and few in between. I have a lot more trust in my fellow citizens than I do any politician any day. And so we got to get back to a point where politicians trust. And I think the only way to do that is power seduces. You know, you can put the best person in the world in office, and if they're there long enough, they get used to that power because it feels good to have that type of wand, if you will, that you can use against the people. But it's temporary. That's power that's on loan to you, and you have to be accountable in the way in which you use it. We talked earlier about voice votes. You know, there's an accountability. We all have to be accountable to someone, whether it be for financial stuff, the power, and we've got to get politicians back to that level where that's enforced. It's a tragedy. And hey, I will put in a plug for your book as well. I've been reading Derek's book. Very, very well written thus far, and I think it's going to be a really hot item when it gets out there. I love it.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I still got a lot of work left to do on it, and there's going to be some there are going to be some parts that everybody who reads it is going to find something in this book to disagree with. But that's kind of what makes the book awesome. Is that
sure?
You know, I'm approaching this project from a standpoint of liberty, regardless if I agree with it or disagree with it. Now, obviously, with this being a book about my philosophies on liberty, I agree with everything that I'm writing in this book. But you know, that doesn't mean that somebody's going to open it up to, you know, chapter whatever and say, "Wow, this guy's absolutely off his rocker." But you know what? That's fine. That's as I kind of said in the first chapter of it, and this is a spoiler for everybody who hasn't. Well, nobody's read it really. But liberty's not a beautiful thing. Liberty is actually quite ugly because that means that people get to act in a way that you don't like. You know, I use the analogy that Liberty is not the Veterans Day parade down Main Street with red, white, and blue confetti and Lee Greenwood's "God Bless the USA" playing on the PA.
No.
Liberty is protesting that parade by burning the American flag, and you know it's just one of those things where we need to understand that just because we don't like something or just because we don't endorse it as a good idea doesn't mean that we have
liberty.
The authority.
Yeah, liberty can be great and it can be the worst.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to think of the founding of our nation when we finally did get away from England and the war was over. The picture that's painted was everyone lived happily ever after. Well, think about the suffering of not having the resources of England here in this nation initially. People had to build everything anew.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of hard work to come in and have that independence as anyone. You know, you and I, in the way our founders saw it, should be granted or not granted because those can't be granted. That's poor choice of words. But you and I should realize that liberty that's ours to either be free enough to succeed with the sky being the limit, or we also have the liberty to fail miserably to the lowest depths of the earth. And so that is, it's agency. It's about agency, and agency is a principle. A lot of people don't like it anymore because agency also has with it a set of being accountability.
Yeah.
You know, you make a mistake, you do something the wrong way, you're going to be accountable for it. You cannot avoid those consequences. But at the same time, you should never be penalized for having those upside, those pluses to liberty as well when you do something right. And that's what we have done as a nation, is we've succeeded in punishing people when they do something good, or when they could have something good.
Absolutely.
And that's where we're at. So
absolutely. Well, Jamie, I'm going to wrap things up here. I really appreciate you being on my show today. You know, guys, go check out their Facebook page. It's Protected Criminality Movie. I've got the links in the show notes along with their GoFundMe. And if you can, throw a couple of dollars their way, help them get this project funded, and let's make this a reality. I appreciate it, guys. Until next Sunday, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo.